The morning came in slow, the way Kansas mornings always did in October, as if the land itself was in no hurry to wake up and face whatever the day would bring. Frost still clung to the long grass along the fence lines, and the sky above Harrington Ranch held that particular shade of pale gray that promised cold air and hard work in equal measure. Garrett Calloway had been standing beside the main barn for nearly 20 minutes. His list of morning tasks was folded in his left hand, though he had not looked at it once. He was a man who rarely needed reminders about what needed doing. The list was more habit than necessity, a way of organizing his thoughts before the rest of the ranch woke up and the day began pulling him in 12 directions at once. He was looking at the road. The wagon trail that connected Harrington Ranch to the town of Concordia stretched south through the prairie like a pale scar across the golden grass. Nothing moved on it. Nothing had moved on it for the better part of an hour. But Garrett kept his eyes on that road with the same steady attention he gave to thunderheads, building on the horizon that particular kind of patient watching that a man develops when he has spent enough years understanding that the most important things often arrive without warning. Fletcher Harrington came around the corner of the barn smelling of hay and cattle, wiping his hands on a cloth that was already beyond saving. He was 27 years old, broad across the shoulders, with the easy grin of a man who found genuine pleasure in the physical work of ranch life. He looked at Garrett, then looked at the road, then looked back at Garrett. "She comes in today," Fletcher said. It was not a question. "Wagon from the Concordia station. Afternoon." Garrett did not look away from the road. Colt went to fetch her. Fletcher was quiet for a moment. He tucked the cloth into his back pocket and crossed his arms over his chest. "Colt went," he said slowly. "Or Cal went." Garrett finally turned his head and looked at Fletcher directly. He said nothing. The answer was plain enough without words, and both men understood it completely. Fletcher let out a long breath through his nose. He looked at the road again, then at the frost on the fence pads, then at the pale scape. He was thinking about his brother, the way he often did in quiet moments, with that mixture of deep affection and careful worry that had become as natural to him as breathing over the past several years. "One of these days," Fletcher said quietly, "that hat is going to cause more trouble than it solves." Garrett unfolded his task list, looked at it for the first time, and folded it back up again. "One of these days," he agreed. Neither man said anything more about it. They went back to their work, and the road stayed empty, and the frost kept melting off the fence posts as the pale October sun climbed slowly toward the middle of the sky. The town of Concordia, Kansas, sat at the edge of the flat world, the kind of place that existed primarily to serve the surrounding land and the people who worked it. Its main street held the general store, the land office, two saloons, a livery, the church, and the train station. At its southern end, a modest wooden structure that always smelled of coal smoke and strangers. Colt Harrington arrived at the station on horseback 40 minutes before the afternoon train was due, tied his horse at the rail, and leaned against the wall of the station building in the manner of a man with nowhere pressing to be. He wore denim trousers, worn pale at the knees, a work shirt faded to the color of a summer sky past its peak, and a hat that had seen considerably better years. His boots were serviceable, but nothing more. His hands, resting easy at his sides, were calloused in the particular way that comes from real work, not decorative effort, and there was dust on his clothes that had been earned honestly on his own land, moving his own cattle. He was 32 years old, dark-haired, lean through the jaw, with eyes of a particular shade of green that seemed slightly at odds with the worn roughness of everything else about him, as if some more careful version of the man existed somewhere beneath the dust and the faded clothes and the deliberately easy posture. The people who moved through the station that afternoon saw a ranch hand, A hired man waiting on someone perhaps, or killing time between jobs. Several of them glanced at him and looked away without interest. This was precisely the effect he intended. He had been doing this for 8 months. The practice had begun after the worst spring the ranch had seen in 5 years. 4 men he had hired, men with solid references and decent track records, had spent 6 months at Harrington Ranch, building his trust one careful gesture at a time, before he discovered they had been selling his cattle to buyers in Abilene the entire time. The financial damage was significant. The damage to his understanding of how men actually behaved, as opposed to how they behaved and they knew who was watching, had been considerably more significant. He had started riding into Concordia dressed as an ordinary working man, sitting in saloons and general stores, and the feed merchant's back room listening to the conversations that only happened when Colt Harrington was not present. He had learned more about his own operation, his own employees, and the general opinions of his neighbors in 8 months of this practice than in the 5 years before it combined. He told himself it was practical. He told himself it was necessary. He had not yet examined too carefully whether there were other reasons he found it easier to exist in the world as Cal Hayes' hired hand than as Colt Harrington, owner of the largest cattle operation in the county. The train arrived at 2:47 in the afternoon, hissing and clanking into the station with the self-important ceremony of a machine that knew its own importance. A handful of passengers stepped down onto the platform. A traveling merchant with 2 large cases, an older couple who were clearly expected by the family rushing to greet them, a man in a dark suit who went directly to the land office without looking right or left. And then Marin Whitfield stepped down from the train, and Colt Harrington pushed himself away from the wall of the station building and felt something shift very slightly in his chest, the way the air changes just before weather arrives. She was 22 years old, though she carried herself with a composure that suggested someone older, someone who had learned early that the world did not reward visible uncertainty. She wore a traveling dress of dark gray wool, practical and well-made, though showing the honest wear of a long journey. Her hair was dark brown, pinned up in the neat, efficient style of a woman who had more important things to think about than elaborate arrangements. She was carrying a single bag, a sturdy carpet bag that looked like it contained everything she owned in the world. What Colt noticed first, before any particular feature, was the way she moved. She did not stop at the bottom of the train steps and look around with the wide eyes of someone overwhelmed by an unfamiliar place. She stepped down, set her bag on the platform beside her feet, and then stood very still for approximately 10 seconds. Her gaze moving carefully and methodically around the station, in the way that a person moves their eyes when they are conducting an actual assessment of a situation, rather than simply looking for something familiar to anchor themselves to. She was reading the platform the way he read a room. He crossed the platform toward her with his hat pulled low and his stride unhurried. "Miss Whitfield." She turned and looked at him. Her eyes were gray, and they did what her eyes apparently always did, which was look at a thing directly and completely, as if partial attention was a form of dishonesty she was not willing to engage in. "Yes," she said, "I'm Cal Hayes. I work out at the Harrington place. Mr. Harrington sent me to fetch you." There was a pause. It was not a long pause, perhaps 2 seconds, perhaps 3, but it was the pause of a person who was noting something, filing it away, deciding what to do with it. Then she said, "All right, Mr. Hayes," and picked up her bag. He offered to take it. She let him without the fluttery protest or the excessive gratitude that some women would have offered. She simply handed him the bag and fell into step beside him, and they walked together to the wagon without speaking, and the October afternoon went on around them, as if nothing of particular importance had just occurred. The road from Concordia to Harrington Ranch covered 12 miles of Kansas prairie, And in October, in the mid-afternoon light, that prairie was something worth looking at. The grass had turned gold and amber, and a dark reddish brown that was almost the color of dried blood. The sky was wide and clear and faintly lit with a quality of light that only comes in autumn when the sun has moved far enough south to illuminate things from a different angle than the one you spend the rest of the year with. Colt drove the wagon with the easy competence of someone who had been handling horses since before he was old enough to understand that it was a skill rather than simply a natural condition of existence. The team moved well for him. They always did. Animals could read the difference between a man who knew what he was doing and a man who was pretending to know, and they responded accordingly. Beside him on the wagon seat, Marin Whitfield was quiet. Not the strained quiet of someone trying to think of something to say, not the uncomfortable quiet of someone waiting to be spoken to, but a settled, watchful quiet, the quiet of a person who was comfortable existing in their own attention. She was looking at the prairie, at the grass moving in the wind, at the cattle visible on a low hillside to the east, dark shapes against the gold. They had been on the road for nearly half an hour before she spoke. "How long have you been driving horses?" she asked. Her voice was level, genuinely curious with no particular social performance attached to it. "Since I was small," he said. "My father put me up on a wagon seat when I was about 4 years old. Said a man ought to know how to handle a team before he learned to do much else." There was a moment of quiet, then she said, "I grew up in a house where horses were other people's concern, but I know the difference between someone who learned a thing and someone who was born knowing it. The way a person holds the reins, the way their weight shifts when the ground changes under the wheels." She paused. "You were born knowing it?" He kept his eyes on the road. "That's an interesting observation for a cook to make." "I've spent my life watching how people do things," she said simply. "It teaches you a great deal." The wagon rolled on through the golden grass. A hawk turned in wide circles far above them. To the west, the sun had begun its slow descent toward the flat edge of the world. Then, without particular buildup, without any change in her tone, Marin Whitfield said, "The advertisement I responded to was signed by someone with the initial C. Harrington. I'm wondering if you are Colt Harrington." The question landed in the space between them with the clean weight of something that had been carefully considered before being placed there. Not an accusation, not a confrontation, simply a question that required an honest answer from a woman who had decided that honest answers were the only kind worth pursuing. He kept his hands on the reins. "I'm Cal Hayes," he said. "You told me your name," she said. "I'm asking if you are the man who placed that advertisement." The second silence was longer than the first. The wagon wheels turned. The grass moved. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark called once and then was quiet. "Why do you want to know?" he asked, and his voice had shifted slightly, the deliberate drawl of Cal Hayes thinning just enough at the edges to reveal something with more education in it, something that had been sitting a little too carefully on a less comfortable accent. She turned her head and looked at him with those direct gray eyes. "Because if you are," she said, "I would rather know it now than after I've arrived somewhere I can't easily leave." He said nothing for a moment. The hawk above them had drifted south and was gone. "Fair enough," he said at last, and the drawl had gone entirely. She did not say anything in response to that. She turned back to look at the road ahead, and her expression did not change in any way that he could have described, and she said nothing else until the ranch buildings came into view on the far side of a low hill, and she said only, "That's a fine-looking operation," in the tone of someone making an honest professional assessment. He found to his considerable surprise that he had no response to that either. Harrington Ranch occupied a long, shallow valley between two low rises of prairie ground And in the October afternoon light, it had the quality of something that had grown naturally from the land rather than been imposed upon it. The main house was 2 stories, white-painted wood, with a wide porch running along the front and south side. Behind and beside it spread the working apparatus of a serious cattle operation. The large barn with its red-painted siding, the equipment shed, the bunkhouse set back at a respectful distance, the corrals where 3 horses stood in the late afternoon shade, the smokehouse, the root cellar, the kitchen garden still holding a few late-season plants along its south-facing wall. Fletcher Harrington was visible at the near fence line repairing a section of post and rail that had apparently come down in last week's wind. He was working with the focused physicality of a man who enjoyed using his body for useful purposes, and he did not look up when the wagon came through the gate until it was close enough for him to see who was on the seat. He looked at his brother. He looked at the woman beside his brother. He looked back at his brother. His mouth began to form a word, and then something in Colt's expression, something minimal, a slight change in the set of his jaw, a very particular kind of stillness in his eyes stopped the word before it arrived. Fletcher closed his mouth. He lifted his chin in a brief nod. "Miss," he said to Marin and went back to his fence repair. Garrett Calloway was at the far end of the yard near the entrance to the main barn with a ledger book open in his hands. He was a man who carried his 35 years in his posture rather than his face straight and measured with the kind of economy in his movements that develops in people who have learned to think before they act and to act only when thinking is finished. His hair was dark brown going gray at the temples. His face was weathered without being worn a distinction that matters in that country. He looked up when the wagon came to a stop. He looked at Marin Whitfield in exactly the way Fletcher had described to him many times the way Garrett always looked at new arrivals, as if he were reading a document and deciding whether its contents were reliable. His eyes moved to her hands first, the way she held her bag in her lap, the absence of nervousness in her grip, the way she sat on the wagon seat without the braced quality of someone who had found the journey difficult. Then to her face, the quality of attention in her eyes, the steadiness of her expression. He looked back at his ledger. He took the pencil from behind his ear and made a note. Years later, when Fletcher asked him about it, he admitted that the note read only, "She'll stay." Harriet Holt appeared on the kitchen porch before Colt had finished helping Marin down from the wagon. A woman in her middle 50s with the purposeful bearing of someone who understood that efficiency was a form of respect for other people's time. She was not unkind. She was simply someone who had learned that warmth could be expressed through competence as readily as through sentiment. "Miss Whitfield," she said, "there's a room off the kitchen. I'll show you, and then we'll go over the schedule. Breakfast is at 5:30, dinner at noon, supper at 6. Mr. Harrington is particular about his coffee." She was inside and moving before she finished the last sentence, and Marin picked up her bag and followed her without hesitation, and Colt stood beside the wagon in the afternoon light and watched until the kitchen door closed behind them. Marin Whitfield was alone in the kitchen at 7:30 that evening, an hour after she had served the ranch hands the supper that had apparently surprised them considerably, judging by the silence that fell over the bunkhouse table when the first forkfuls went in. She had made a simple stew, heavy with root vegetables with biscuits, that she had mixed from memory while the stew simmered. It was not a complicated meal. But she had learned from her mother, who had learned from long experience, that feeding people well had less to do with elaborate preparation than with attention, with the understanding that food made with genuine care tasted different from food assembled by obligation, and that working men knew the difference, even if they could not have explained it. The young cowboy who had come back for a third biscuit and then stood there turning his hat in his hands, unable to find a sentence, had been enough confirmation. She was washing the large pots now, working with the systematic efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. The kitchen was warm from the stove. Outside the small window above the sink, the Kansas night had come on fully, the sky enormous and very dark, scattered with more stars than she had ever seen in Philadelphia, where the gas lamps always kept the sky at a comfortable distance. She heard the back door open. She did not turn around. The sound of his boots on the wooden floor was different from the sound she had heard earlier. Not the measured, slightly studied stride of Cal Hayes, but something more natural, longer in the step, the walk of a man in his own house. Miss Whitfield. She finished the pot she was working on and set it on the drying rack before she turned. He was standing in the doorway of the kitchen in clean trousers and a pressed shirt, his dark hair damp and combed back from his face. The hat was gone. The studied weathering of Cal Hayes was gone. The deliberate ease was gone. In its place was something more complicated and considerably more honest, a man of 32 who owned a great deal and had not yet decided whether that was something to be comfortable with. His eyes were very green in the lamplight. "Welcome to Harrington Ranch," he said. "I'm Colt Harrington, the owner." She looked at him for a moment. Then she set down the cloth she was holding, straightened, and said with the particular quality of calm that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from long practice in managing it. "I know who you are. You're also the man who drove me here under a borrowed hat and a story about being someone's hired hand." Something happened in his expression. It was not quite surprise, but it was close to it, the look of a man who had prepared for several possible responses to this moment and was discovering that the actual response was none of them. "How?" he said, not a question with a rising inflection. Just the word flat and genuinely wanting to understand. "Your hands," she said, "a farm hand and the man who owns the farm hold the reins differently. A man who works other people's land watches the road. A man who works his own land watches the land beside the road." She paused. "You were watching the land the whole way from Concordia." Colt Harrington leaned against the doorframe and said nothing for what felt like a long time. "And you didn't say anything," he said at last. "I was waiting to see what you would do when we arrived." She turned back to the sink and picked up the next pot. "You handled it badly." "I know. Your brother almost said your name twice." "I know that too." She washed the pot. The water in the basin had gone lukewarm, and she added hot water from the kettle on the stove without interrupting the conversation. And there was something in that simple domestic competence, in the way she continued working while they talked, that seemed to settle something in the room. "I need to explain," he said. "You need to do more than explain," she said. "But yes, start with that." He came further into the kitchen, then not sitting but moving away from the door, the way a person moves when they are accepting that a conversation is going to take a certain amount of time and requires more than a doorway's worth of space. He stopped beside the table. He picked up an apple from the bowl, there turned it in his hands without eating it, set it back down. "8 months ago," he said, "I lost close to a year's profit because I trusted 4 men who had excellent references and the patience to behave like honest people for 6 months before they stopped bothering." He paused. "I'm not a man who makes the same mistake twice." "So you dress as a hired hand and watch people before they know they're being watched." "I listen," he said, "to what people say when they don't know who I am. In the town, in the saloon, at the feed merchant. People behave differently around money, around ownership, around the kind of man they think they need something from." "That part I understand," she said quietly. Something in the way she said it made him stop. There was a weight in those 4 words that was not bitterness exactly, but was not far from it either, the particular weight of a long experience rather than a passing thought. The references you carry, he said after a moment. She did not answer immediately. She finished the pot in her hands and placed it with the others. Then she turned and dried her hands on the cloth at her waist and looked at him. They were written by the same person, that she said, despite claiming to come from two different sources. The phrasing at the end of each letter, the way the comma falls after the word recommend, the capital letters on the word household. He met her eyes. I know honest penmanship when I see it. Then you know I came here with forged references. I know you came here with the best option available to you. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down, folding his hands on the wood in front of him. Not the posture of an employer addressing an employee, the posture of someone who has decided to have an honest conversation. What happened in Philadelphia? The question was direct. It did not perform sympathy or demand explanation. It simply asked the way a person asks when they actually want to know the answer and are willing to hear whatever it is. Marin sat down at the other end of the table. She told him. Not the way she had imagined telling it, which was in some distant future to some faceless official who needed to know, with all the defensive qualifications and careful framings she had been rehearsing for months. She told it the way she told it now, plainly, and in order the Davenport household, 4 years of good work. Lawrence Davenport's gradual escalation of unwanted attentions the night he came to her room, and she fought him off loudly enough to bring the housekeeper running, and Mrs. Davenport the next morning with her cold eyes and her cold conclusions, and the dismissal without reference that left Marin with nothing but her skill, her friend Agnes's loyalty, and a forged pair of letters. She told it without ornament, without seeking a particular response. She told it the way she told everything, as information, as the truth of what had occurred, and when she was finished, she folded her hands on the table and waited. Colt Harrington was quiet for a moment. His hands were still on the table. His expression had not moved through anything dramatic during her account. No visible outrage, no performed sympathy, which she was grateful for because she had seen both of those things deployed as performances before and knew them for what they were. What she saw instead was something simpler. A man thinking, a man deciding what something meant. I believe you, he said, not as a courtesy, as a conclusion. She looked at him. The way you told it, he said, people who invent things fill in more details than the truth requires. You left out the things that weren't necessary. He paused. And the fear you carry isn't the fear of someone guilty. It's the fear of someone who knows that truth and evidence aren't always the same thing. She held his gaze for a moment, then she looked down at the table. What I would ask, he said, is whether the trouble you left behind in Philadelphia poses any danger to this ranch or the people on it. No, she said. It's the kind of trouble that ruins reputations. It doesn't follow people with legal authority. Then here is what I'm proposing, he said. You stay, you cook, you do the work you were hired to do, and you do it as honestly as I can tell you'll do it. I ask no more questions about your past. In return, I'll ask for your discretion about the other matter. About Cal Hayes. She looked at him steadily. You intend to continue the practice. For now. May I ask why you know who I am now? What I'm actually here for? The reason for the deception in my case is resolved. He considered this. Because there are other people coming through this ranch, he said, and because it still works in ways I'm not ready to give up. It will stop working, she said, the first time someone who knows you sees you in that hat. He met her eyes. Then I'll deal with that when it happens. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at his hands on the table, the callous, genuine hands of a man who actually worked his own land. And she thought about the 2 hours on the wagon and the green eyes watching the grass and the apple turned in those hands and set carefully back in the bowl. There was a line in the advertisement, she said, that the position could lead to marriage if suitable. He did not look away. That was an honest statement, not part of the performance. No. She looked at him for another moment, then she nodded once, a small, definitive motion, the gesture of a person who has made a decision and intends to keep it. Then we have an understanding, Mr. Harrington, she said. Colt, he said. Or Colt when we're alone. Mr. Harrington makes me feel like someone I'm still deciding whether to be. She stood up and picked up the cloth from the table and turned back to the sink. Good night, Colt, she said. He stood up as well. He moved toward the door. He stopped. Miss Whitfield. He did not turn around. If there were no advertisement, no terms of employment, no reason for you to be here at all, would you have wanted a cup of coffee and an honest conversation tonight anyway? She was quiet for just a moment. Probably, she said. You're the first person today who talked to me like I was capable of handling the truth. He went out. The door settled closed behind him. Marin stood at the sink in the warm kitchen with the cool night pressing gently at the window glass, and she looked at the 2 cups on the table, his still sitting there, and she thought about a man who watched his own land, the way you watch something you loved, and she decided slowly and without drama that Kansas might be worth staying in after all. In the barn, half an hour later, Colt sat on a hay bale with his elbows on his knees and his hat in his hands. The horses moved softly in their stalls. The night air came through the upper windows with the smell of dry grass and coming cold. Fletcher found him there the way Fletcher always found him, by walking directly to the place where Colt would go when he needed to think without being watched. Fletcher sat down on the bale across from his brother without being invited and without needing to be. She figured it out, Fletcher said. It was also not a question. On the wagon, inside the first 2 hours, Fletcher blew out a breath. Well, 8 months, Colt said. No one in 8 months. To be fair, Fletcher said, most of the people in town aren't looking for the owner of a cattle ranch when they look at a man in a worn-out hat. She came here specifically to meet Colt Harrington. She was going to look harder. She looked at my hands, Colt said, the way I hold the reins. Fletcher was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? She's staying. Colt turned his hat in his hands. She can cook. She's honest. She told me about Philadelphia straight, no preparation, no argument, just the facts in order. And Colt looked at his brother. Fletcher had always been able to read him from the time they were boys with an accuracy that was occasionally inconvenient and always somehow a comfort. And Colt said, she told me I was the first person today who talked to her like she was capable of handling the truth. Fletcher was quiet again for a longer moment. Outside somewhere far off across the prairie, a coyote called once thin and distant. You know, Garrett made a note in his ledger when she got off the wagon, Fletcher said. I know what the note said. How do you know? Because it's what I thought when she looked at the ranch from the wagon seat and said it was a fine-looking operation before she'd even gotten down. Fletcher nodded slowly. He looked at the horse in the nearest stall who was looking back at them with the mild, untroubled interest of an animal that has decided people are generally harmless. Colt, he said, you need to tell her about Father's will. The silence that followed was the longest one of the night. I know, Colt said. Edmund knows she's coming. He'll find out she's here within a week. He's going to use it. I know that too. Then tell her before he does. Fletcher stood up and dusted the hay from his trousers. She handled the truth about you just fine. She'll handle the rest. He walked out of the barn and left his brother sitting in the hay smell and the horse quiet and the West Kansas dark, turning his hat in his hands, thinking about a woman who watched the road the way a person watched something they were deciding whether to trust. Through the far window of the barn, the kitchen light was still burning. It burned for a long time before it finally went out. The first 3 weeks at Harrington Ranch passed the way good work always passes, in a rhythm so honest and consuming that the mind stops measuring time and simply moves from one necessary thing to the next. Maren Whitfield rose before 4 every morning. She did this not because Harriet Holt had told her to, though the schedule demanded it, but because she had risen before 4 every morning of her working life and her body had long since stopped asking permission. She lit the kitchen stove in the dark, listening to the ranch wake up around her, the horses moving in the barn, the first voices of the hands crossing the yard, the particular creak of the bunkhouse door that she had already learned meant the older cowboy named Pruitt was the first one up and always would be. By the time the sky went from black to the deep gray blue that preceded actual dawn, she had biscuits in the oven baking in 2 large iron skillets and coffee in the biggest pot the kitchen owned. The first morning the men had come in with the resigned, slightly braced expression of people expecting adequate food and prepared to be grateful for it. They had sat down and the first round of biscuits had gone around the table, and there had been a silence of perhaps 90 seconds while 15 men were too occupied with eating to produce speech. Then the reaching had started, the quiet competitive efficiency of men who have discovered there is something worth having and intend to have more of it before it disappears. The young cowboy named Doyle had come back 3 times and then stood near the kitchen door, with his hat in his hands, his face the particular shade of red that belongs to men who are not accustomed to expressing gratitude directly and are finding the effort physically uncomfortable. "Miss Whitfield," he had managed finally, "this is the finest breakfast I have had since I left my mother's table." "Then your mother was an excellent cook," Maren had said, and turned back to the stove, and Doyle had retreated in a state of visible relief. It was during the second week that she discovered the spice shelf. The kitchen at Harrington Ranch was better equipped than any working ranch kitchen she had encountered, which told her something about the priorities of its owner. The spices were extensive, the stores well organized, the equipment maintained with a care that went beyond minimum necessity, but the spice shelf had been arranged in alphabetical order, a system that was logical in a library and very nearly useless in an active kitchen where proximity to the stove and frequency of use mattered enormously, and the alphabet was irrelevant. She rearranged it on a Tuesday morning before the household was fully awake, organizing by use and heat tolerance, and the logical sequence of what got added to what and when. She did not know he had come in until he spoke. "Who arranged the spices like this?" She turned. Colt Harrington was standing at the entrance to the kitchen in his work clothes, holding an empty coffee cup and looking at the shelf with an expression that was entirely impossible to categorize. "I did," she said. "The alphabetical system doesn't work in a functioning kitchen." "I know," he said. "That's why I came in early, to see how you'd fix it." She looked at him. He looked at her. There was a moment in which the kitchen held only the sound of the stove and the distant sound of morning on the ranch, and then she turned back to the biscuit dough she was working and said, "The coffee is on the back burner. It's been there since 4:15. He poured his coffee. He leaned against the counter in the manner that she was beginning to recognize as his preferred position in this room. Back to the wall, the whole kitchen visible, a posture that managed to be both relaxed and completely attentive. He did not pick up a newspaper. He did not look at anything in particular. He simply stood there and drank his coffee while she worked, and the morning went on around them. And neither of them pointed out that this was the third day in a row he had appeared in the kitchen at this particular hour. In the third week, Fletcher cut his hand on a length of wire fence. It was not a serious injury, a clean cut across the heel of his palm that bled freely for several minutes, but required nothing more than proper cleaning and a tight bandage. He came to the kitchen door, and Marin had seen the cloth wrapped around his hand and had brought him inside without a word, sat him at the table, and cleaned and dressed the wound with the efficient, unhurried competence of someone who had dealt with kitchen injuries since childhood and had no interest in making the patient feel worse about the situation than necessary. She did not ask him how badly it hurt. She did not perform concern. She simply did what needed doing, tied off the bandage, and said, "Don't get it wet for 3 days," and put away the supplies. Later that evening, Fletcher relayed the episode to Garrett near the equipment shed. "She didn't hover," Fletcher said. "Didn't make a production of it, just fixed it. She's been in other people's houses long enough to know when talking helps and when working helps," Garrett said without looking up from the harness he was examining. "Colt was in the kitchen again this morning." "I know. That's 5 mornings in a row." "I know that too." Fletcher looked at the older man. "Is it obvious to everyone or just to us?" Garrett set the harness down and looked at Fletcher with the patient expression of a man who has answered a question without words so many times that he has become genuinely efficient at it. Fletcher nodded. "Right," he said. On a Thursday morning at the end of the third week, Colt set a folded document on the kitchen table in front of Marin and sat down across from her. She was between tasks, the breakfast cleared and the bread dough set to rise, and the first preparations for the midday meal not yet begun. She was drinking coffee, the second cup of the morning, a small ritual she had allowed herself since the first week when it became clear that the coffee at Harrington Ranch was genuinely excellent, and that no one was going to object to her having a quiet quarter hour in the kitchen before the noon rush began. She looked at the document. She looked at him. "Page 3, he said. "Second clause." She unfolded it. It was a legal instrument, several pages of dense language in the careful hand of a trained professional, and she read with the focused attention of a woman who had learned early that the fine print in other people's arrangements was usually the most important part. The second clause on page 3 was not complicated in its fundamentals. William Harrington, deceased, had required by the terms of his will that his son and sole heir, Colt Harrington, be lawfully married before the date of his 33rd birthday, which fell in September of the following year, 1879. In the event that this condition was not met, 50% of the total holdings of Harrington Ranch, including all land, livestock, equipment, and associated financial interests, would pass to Edmund Harrington, the deceased's brother. She read it through twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and set it back on the table. "How long?" she said. 11 months. The deadline is September of next year. And if the condition isn't met, Edmund gets half, not enough to take the ranch outright, enough to make every decision a negotiation, and every negotiation a fight for as long as it takes him to wear me down." She was quiet for a moment. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "You placed the advertisement because of this." "Partly." "What's the other part?" He met her eyes across the table. "I placed the advertisement because I am 32 years old, and I have been running this ranch for 5 years, and I have not had a single honest conversation with a single person who did not work for me or grow up with me in all of that time." He paused. Fletcher came up with the idea. He said, "If I wanted to meet someone who would see me rather than the land I owned, I ought to meet them before they knew about the land." She looked at him steadily. So the advertisement was genuine. The intent was genuine. The method was complicated. Was I the only respondent? No, there were 43 responses over 6 weeks. She absorbed this. And you chose me. Fletcher chose you. He read all the letters. He said yours was the only one that talked about work. She was quiet again. The bread dough was rising gently in the bowl on the counter. The stove made its small domestic sounds. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to answer it honestly. All right, if there were no will, no Edmund, no deadline, no threat of any kind, would you still be sitting at this table? He did not answer immediately. He looked at the table, at the document between them, at his own hands flat on the wood. When he looked up, his expression had the quality of a man who has decided that there is no version of this moment that is improved by a careful answer. I would have asked you to sit down and talk on the second morning, he said. When I came in and found you had rearranged the spice shelf and were pretending you hadn't touched it. She looked at him. Something moved in her expression, not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. I wasn't pretending. You had flour on your left sleeve, and you were standing 6 inches to the right of the shelf with your arms crossed. She looked down at her sleeve, which was clean now. Then she looked back at him. I'll need to think about what you've told me. I know. All of it, not just the will. I know that too. She stood up and went back to the bread dough, and the conversation was finished without being resolved, and Colt sat at the table a moment longer before he stood up and took his coffee outside to the porch. And the morning continued around the ranch with its accustomed indifference to the interior lives of the people moving through it. That evening, she told him about Edmund's visit the previous afternoon when Colt had been out in the south pasture. The way Edmund had asked about Philadelphia before he had any reason to know she came from there. The way his eyes had moved to her left hand and stayed there for half a second too long. Colt set down the cup he was holding. He's already investigating you. He knew the name Davenport, she said, not as a guess, as a fact. Then we have less time than I thought, he said. Edmund Harrington arrived at the ranch for the second time on a Friday afternoon, and he brought company. The woman's name was Victoria Ashmore. She was 28 years old, well-dressed in the manner of someone whose wardrobe received regular professional attention, with the careful posture of a woman who had been taught since childhood that how you held your body communicated your position in the world. She was genuinely attractive and clearly intelligent, and she wore both of these qualities with the slightly uncomfortable air of someone who had been told they were advantages without being entirely certain they felt like advantages. Edmund introduced her over the supper table with the smooth satisfaction of a man playing what he believed to be a decisive card. Her father owned the largest bank in Topeka. Her family had extensive property holdings. She was by any measure that Edmund Harrington would have recognized as relevant, a suitable match for the owner of a significant cattle operation in need of an heir. Colt received this information with the polite attentiveness of a man listening to a business proposal he has already decided to decline. He was courteous to Victoria Ashmore, genuinely so, because she had done nothing to deserve discourtesy. But he did not lean toward her. He did not direct questions to her that were warmer than necessity required. He sat at the head of his table in his own house and was a polite host to both his guests, and the warmth he showed one was indistinguishable from the warmth he showed the other. Fletcher, 3 seats down, kept his expression admirably neutral. Garrett at the far end of the table ate with the focused attention of a man who finds food genuinely interesting and the social theater of ambitious relatives entirely unworthy of his attention. Myron served the meal. She was efficient and pleasant and professionally invisible, which was what the role required, and she had spent enough years being professionally invisible to do it without effort. Edmund's first attempt at destabilization came between the soup and the main course. "Miss Whitfield," he said with the pleasant tone of a man making agreeable conversation, "you come to us from Philadelphia. I have a number of business associates in that city, the Davenport family, for instance, quite prominent in certain circles. I wonder if you might have encountered them during your time there." The table did not go entirely quiet, but something in the air of it changed. Fletcher's fork paused for just a moment before continuing. Garrett set his glass down with the careful precision of someone choosing to do something slow. Marin, refilling the water glass nearest to her, completed the action before she replied. "I worked for the Davenport household for 4 years," she said in the same level tone she used for everything. "Whether they remember me well or poorly depends entirely on which member of the household you ask and what they've decided they remember about the reasons I left. Families in that position generally prefer a tidy version of events." Edmund's smile did not waver, but something behind it recalculated. "A curious answer," he said. "It's an accurate one," she said and moved to the next glass. Garrett picked his fork back up. The meal continued. After the table was cleared and Marin was in the kitchen and the sound of conversation from the dining room had settled into the lower register of men finishing their evening, Victoria Ashmore came through the kitchen door. She stood just inside the doorway for a moment, looking at Marin with an expression that was somewhere between assessment and something more complicated. Then she came and sat down at the kitchen table, which was not something guests of the house typically did, and folded her hands in front of her. "I want you to know," she said quietly, "that I did not come here by my own choice." Marin continued washing the serving dishes. "I didn't assume you had. My father thinks this is an excellent opportunity. Edmund Harrington is very persuasive when he wants to be." Victoria looked at her hands. "I'm aware of what I am in this situation, a piece being moved on a board. You could say no." "I know that. I'm still learning how." She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up at Marin with a directness that was clearly not her habitual mode, but that she was making a conscious effort toward. "Colt Harrington watches you, not the way a man watches a woman he employs. A different way entirely. Edmund hasn't noticed it, but I have." Marin did not respond to this immediately. She set the dish she was holding in the rack. "I'm sorry you were brought here under false pretenses," she said finally. Victoria stood up. "So am I." She paused at the door. "I hope things work out the way they ought to for whoever they ought to work out for." Then she went back to the dining room, and the door swung closed behind her. Marin stood at the sink for a long moment, looking at the window above it, which gave back nothing but darkness and the faint reflection of the kitchen light. She was still standing there when Colt came in. He did not say anything about what had happened at the table. He poured the last of the coffee into a cup and set it on the counter near her and leaned against the wall with his arms crossed and his expression held that quality she was learning to read in him, the quality of a man who has something to say and is deciding whether now is the right time to say it. "Edmund already knows more about you than he should," and he said. "I know. He's had someone looking into you, someone with connections to people in Philadelphia." He paused. "His words to me after supper were that results would be available within 2 weeks, that if there were any legal complications attached to your past, the implications for a marriage would be significant." She turned away from the window and looked at him. "He's trying to force me out before anything can be formalized." "Yes." "So that you run out of time before the will's deadline." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. The kitchen was warm and quiet around them. Through the wall, she could hear the distant voices of Edmund and Victoria in the front room. "What are you planning to do?" she asked. "I'm going to find out what he knows," he said. "And I'm going to find out what the rustlers moving through this area have to do with anything, because I don't think it's coincidental that they've shown up at the same time as Edmund's second visit." He straightened. "I'm going into Concordia tomorrow." "As yourself." He was quiet for just a moment. "As Cal." She looked at him. He held her gaze without deflection, and she saw in his expression that he knew what she thought about this and was not yet ready to concede the point. "Be careful," she said finally. He nodded. He took his coffee and went out, and she heard his boots on the porch steps and then the quiet of the yard, and she stood in the warm kitchen for another minute before she began putting out the lamps one by one. He came back from Concordia late in the afternoon of the following day, and Marin knew something was wrong before he reached the kitchen door. She had learned his particular way of moving well enough in 3 weeks to know when his stride had changed, when the easy economy of his normal movement had been replaced by something tighter and more deliberate. He sat down at the kitchen table and waited until she had come and sat across from him. What he had heard in the saloon, listening from a corner table in his faded work clothes and borrowed identity, was this: Edmund Harrington had engaged the services of a man named Harker, a professional intermediary of the type that existed in every city and most large towns. Men who carried legal documents and the threat of legal documents and the social weight of the families who employed them. Harker was traveling from Kansas City. He would be in Concordia within a week. He carried a formal complaint from the Davenport household alleging the theft of jewelry by a domestic employee named Marin Whitfield, a complaint that, while not equivalent to a warrant for arrest, was sufficient to make any social or legal proceeding involving the named individual extremely complicated. He told her all of it, directly, in order. She was very still while he spoke, in the particular way of a person who has trained themselves to receive bad news without visible collapse, because visible collapse has never once helped anything. "They're not actually interested in the jewelry," she said when he finished. "No, the jewelry is the mechanism. Getting you out of Kansas is the goal. Edmund's goal. Edmund provided Davenport with the information about where you were. That's how Harker knew to come here." He paused. "I don't have proof of that, but I am confident enough in the conclusion." She looked at the table, then she looked up at him. "Colt, I won't have my trouble cost you your ranch. That's not what I'm worried about. It should be." "It isn't." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need to tell you something else. Something I should have told you before this. Not about the ranch and not about Edmund." He paused. "The real reason I've been in this kitchen every morning for 3 weeks is not because I need coffee at 5 in the morning." She looked at him. "I have been," he said carefully, "in the position of a man who owns a considerable amount of land and very little of what makes land worth owning. I came back from 4 years at university in the East, and I built this operation with my own hands alongside men I trusted, and I have lived in this house for 5 years, and I have eaten every meal alone or in the company of people I employ, and I had stopped expecting that to change." He looked at her with the directness she had come to understand was simply his natural mode when he had decided honesty was required. "You arrived, and in the first 2 hours you read me more accurately than anyone has in 8 months of trying. And since then, every morning I have looked for reasons to be in this kitchen, and the reasons have gotten thinner every day, and I'm done pretending they're about the coffee." The kitchen was very quiet. "What are you telling me?" she asked. I'm telling you that the proposition in that advertisement was genuine before I knew it would be necessary. And I'm asking you before Harker gets here and before Edmund makes this into something with only one possible answer, whether you would consider it on its own terms. He paused. Not as a solution to a problem, as a choice you make freely for reasons of your own. She looked at him for a long moment. The bread for tomorrow's breakfast was rising on the counter behind him. The evening light came through the kitchen window at the low angle it always had this time of year, and it lay across the table between them like a marker. "Ask me again," she said quietly, "when you've given up the hat." He held her gaze. "What?" "Cal Hayes, the hat. The borrowed identity you put on when you want to understand something without being seen." She spoke without accusation, without pressure, simply as a fact. When you are fully who you are in front of whoever is watching, ask me again. And the answer will be yes. He was very still for a moment. Then slowly he nodded. Once the way he nodded at things that were true and important and going to require him to change something he had been holding on to. The way Garrett nodded when he had made a decision. "In the meantime," she said, rising and going to the stove to check on the evening meal, "you had better write to your lawyer in Kansas City tonight. Whatever documentation can be assembled about the Davenport family's previous behavior is going to be worth more than anything I can say about my own." He sat at the table a moment longer. Then he stood up and he did something he had not done since she arrived. He picked up one of the serving cloths from the counter and began helping her with the work of the evening, quietly and without ceremony. And they moved around the kitchen together in the way that people move when they have been doing something together long enough to know where the other person is going to be. Outside, the Kansas evening settled over the ranch. In the barn, Fletcher noticed that the lamp in the kitchen was still burning when he made his last check at 9 o'clock, and two shadows were visible through the window working side by side. He went back to the bunkhouse and did not mention it to anyone. Some things did not need commentary. Some things were just true and you let them be. The letter from Colt's lawyer in Kansas City arrived on a Wednesday, 6 days after Colt had written. It was brief and it was not good. Harker had already left Kansas City. He had connections in Concordia. He would be there before the end of the week. Colt read the letter at his desk in the study and then carried it to the kitchen. Marin read it standing at the counter. She set it down. She was quiet for the length of a breath, 2 breaths, the particular kind of quiet that is not the absence of feeling, but the management of it. "How long to Kansas City by train from here?" she asked. 2 hours. "How long for your lawyer to prepare documentation on the Davenport family's previous behavior?" "He's already looking. I asked him to start the same night I wrote the letter." He paused. "But it won't be ready before Harker arrives." She turned and looked at him. Behind her through the kitchen window, the October light was the color of old brass. "Colt," she said, "I'm going to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer it the same way." "All right." "If I leave now voluntarily before Harker arrives, does that protect the ranch? Does it take me off the board entirely and give Edmund nothing to use against you?" He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes, which she did without difficulty. "You are not leaving," he said, and his voice had the quality of a man who has made a decision that is not available for renegotiation. "Not because of what it does or doesn't do for the ranch. Not because of Edmund or Harker or the Davenports. You are not leaving because you came here. Honestly, you have worked here honestly, and you have not done a single thing that deserves to be run out of the only safe place you have found." She looked at him steadily. "Marry me," he said, "not as the solution, not as the strategy, as the thing I have wanted to ask since the second morning when I came in and found the spice shelf different and you pretending it wasn't. He paused. The Will Harker, Edmund all of it, those are reasons for the timing. None of them are the reason I'm asking. She did not answer immediately. She looked at his face, at the green eyes that watched things with such attention, at the hands that held the reins the way a man holds what he loves. She remembered what she had said to him. When you are fully who you are in front of whoever is watching. The hat was still in his room. He was standing in his own kitchen, in his own house, on his own land, with his own name, asking her a question that had nothing borrowed in it. Yes, she said. He exhaled. One slow breath, the breath of a man who has been holding something for a very long time. We go today, he said, this afternoon, before Harker reaches town. I know. She untied her apron and set it on the counter. Fletcher should drive us. Garrett should be a witness. Mrs. Holt should be told. Agreed. He paused. Are you certain? She looked at him. I have been more certain of fewer things, she said. Go tell your brother. He went. She stood in the kitchen for a moment alone, her hands at her sides, looking at the window and the October light. And the country she had arrived in 3 weeks ago, with forged papers and very little hope. And she thought about the women who had looked at her on the train with pity, and the men who had looked at her in Philadelphia with calculation. And she thought about a green-eyed man watching his own land from a wagon seat, and she picked up her apron and hung it on its hook with the deliberate care of someone who intends to come back to it, and she went to tell Harriet Holt to put on her good dress. The wedding took place on a Thursday afternoon in late October in the small white church at the south end of Concordia's Main Street, in the company of 4 people and a minister who had known Colt Harrington since the boy was 9 years old and had spent the intervening years waiting for him to find a reason to use the building for something other than Christmas and funerals. Reverend Aldous Crane was 71, dry as the Kansas summer, and possessed of the particular wisdom that develops in men who have stood at the front of a room for 50 years, watching human beings make the most important decisions of their lives. He looked at Colt, and he looked at Marin, and he looked at the 2 men standing behind them, and then he opened his book and performed the ceremony without preamble or embellishment, because some moments do not require decoration. Fletcher Harrington had driven the wagon. He had said almost nothing on the 2-hour ride into town, which was unusual for him, and the silence had not been the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that belongs to moments a person wants to hold carefully. When they arrived at the church and he helped Marin down from the wagon seat, he held her hand a moment longer than the action required and said without looking at her directly, "My mother kept that ring in her jewelry box for 11 years before she died. Colt took it out the day after the funeral and put it in his desk drawer, and it has been there since. I want you to know that." Marin had looked at him. "Thank you, Fletcher," she said. "Fletch," he said, "you're going to be my sister. You can call me Fletch." Garrett Calloway stood on Colt's left throughout the ceremony with the bearing of a man fulfilling a function he considered important and intended to fulfill correctly. He had polished his boots that morning, a fact that Fletcher had noted and not commented on, understanding that for Garrett Calloway, the polishing of boots was the equivalent of another man weeping openly. Harriet Holt stood beside Marin in her good dress, a deep blue wool that she wore perhaps 3 times a year, and she wept without apology and without attempting to stop, because she was a woman who had decided long ago that there was no dignity in pretending not to feel things. The ring was a simple gold band worn smooth on the inside from years of wear. When Colt placed it on Marin's finger, he held her hand in both of his for a moment and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "She deserved more than she got," he said. "I couldn't do anything about that, but I can do right by this." Marin looked at the ring on her hand and then at the man who had put it there. And what she felt in that moment was not the sweep of romantic certainty she had read about in the novels she had borrowed from the library in Philadelphia. It was something quieter and considerably more durable. The feeling of a foundation being laid. They were husband and wife before the sun had moved 2 hours in the sky. The ride back to the ranch was different from the ride into town. Something had settled in the wagon, a quality of stillness that was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of something that did not require speech to exist. Fletcher drove. Garrett sat beside him on the front seat. Colt and Marin sat in the bed of the wagon, and at some point during the first hour, without either of them noting the exact moment it happened, her shoulder was against his arm, and his arm had shifted to accommodate the fact. They ate supper that evening in the kitchen, all four of them plus Harriet, and it was the first time all of them had sat at the same table together without the occasion being purely functional. Harriet had made a cake, a plain pound cake with dried fruit, which she set in the center of the table without comment, and Fletcher cut it with the large kitchen knife and handed pieces around with the careful seriousness of a man conducting a ceremony. No one made a speech. No one needed to. When the meal was finished and the kitchen cleaned and Harriet had gone to her room and Fletcher and Garrett had gone back to the bunkhouse, Colt and Marin sat at the kitchen table with the last of the evening's coffee and the candle burning low between them. "Tell me the rest of it," he said. "All of it, whatever you've been carrying." She looked at him across the table. The candle made the shadows in the kitchen warm and close. She told him the rest, not just the facts of the Davenport situation which she had told him before, but the texture of it. 4 years of making herself smaller. 4 years of learning exactly how invisible a person could become if they were careful and useful and never asked for anything. The specific quality of Mrs. Davenport's face on the morning of the dismissal, not angry but satisfied, the face of a woman resolving a problem, and how that satisfaction had been more damaging than the anger would have been. Agnes, her only friend, who had sat up until 2 in the morning with a lamp and a pen and forged 2 letters that she could have lost her position over, and who had pressed money into Marin's hand at the train station and told her to go far enough that the story couldn't follow her. "She saved my life," Marin said simply. "Not dramatically, practically. That kind of saving matters more." Colt listened to all of it without interruption. When she finished, the candle had burned down considerably, and the kitchen was very quiet. "You're not going to have to be invisible here," he said. She looked at him. "I know that," she said. "I've known it for about 2 weeks." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It was a simple gesture, unhurried and without agenda, the gesture of a man who has decided that this is where his hand belongs. They sat like that for a while in the warm kitchen on the first night of a marriage that had been made in haste for reasons that were real and for reasons that were also real, and the ranch was quiet around them, and the Kansas night pressed gently at the windows, and when the candle finally guttered out, they sat for another moment in the dark before they rose together and went upstairs. The rest of that night belongs to them alone. The morning after the wedding came in the way that changed mornings always do, ordinary in its surface and entirely different in its substance. Marin was in the kitchen before 5, which was simply who she was and had always been. The stove needed lighting. The bread from yesterday needed checking. The ranch would be hungry at 5:30, regardless of what had changed in the house overnight. Colt came downstairs at 4:40, which was 20 minutes earlier than usual, and stood in the kitchen doorway, and when he had stood there, on so many mornings, back to the wall, the whole room visible, she did not turn around. "The coffee," she said, "has been on the back burner since 4:15. He poured a cup. He came and stood beside her at the counter, not in his customary position against the wall, but beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool kitchen air. She handed him the spoon she was using. He took it without comment and began stirring the pot she'd been working on. They stood together at the stove in the early dark, and outside the frost was doing what it always did on October mornings in Kansas. And somewhere in the barn, the horses were moving and the ranch was waking up around them. Harriet came in at 5:15, looked at the two of them at the stove, and went directly to the pantry to retrieve the flour without saying a single word, which was perhaps the most eloquent thing she had said in years. Harker arrived in Concordia on a Friday morning, 2 days after the wedding. He came with two other men, both of them the type that exists specifically to lend physical weight to legal and social pressure, and he went first to the sheriff's office and then to the general store and then to the saloon. And in each of these locations, he asked questions and showed documents and spoke the name Marin Whitfield in the tone of a man who has been paid to make that name sound like a problem. By late morning, the word had moved through Concordia, the way word always moved through small towns, which was faster than anyone who had something to protect would prefer. It reached Harrington Ranch by noon, carried by the feed merchant's boy, who rode out with the delivery and mentioned it in passing to Fletcher, who was working near the gate. Fletcher came directly to the kitchen. Colt was already there. He had been there for most of the morning, working at the kitchen table with documents spread before him, a series of letters and legal instruments that had arrived from Kansas City the previous afternoon, materials his lawyer had assembled with the focused efficiency of a professional who had been given clear instructions and adequate resources. "He's here," Fletcher said from the doorway. "I know." Colt did not look up from the document he was reading. "Send someone to tell Garrett, I want both of you on the porch when they arrive. They'll come here directly. Harker is thorough. He'll finish in town and then come here to deliver the complaint in person. That's how this type of man works." He set the document down and looked at his brother. "This ends today, Fletch, one way or another." Fletcher nodded. He started to go, then stopped. "Colt, how are you going to play this?" "Honestly," Colt said, "for the first time in 8 months, entirely honestly." He looked at Marin, who was at the stove and had been listening to all of this with the quality of attention she brought to everything, the quality that did not perform calm, but was genuinely calm because she had made her decisions and was prepared to stand by them. She met his eyes. She nodded once. He gathered his documents, straightened them against the table, and went upstairs to change into the clothes that belonged to who he actually was. They arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon, Harker and his two men in a hired wagon rolling through the gate of Harrington Ranch with the particular confidence of people who believe they hold the superior position in an encounter that has not yet begun. What they found on the front porch of the main house was not what they had prepared for. Colt Harrington stood at the top of the porch steps in clean trousers, a pressed shirt, and the leather vest that he wore when he conducted business of consequence. His dark hair was combed, his boots were the good ones. He stood with the ease of a man on his own property, which he was, and the stillness of a man who has decided exactly what he intends to do, which he had. To his left stood Fletcher Harrington, 27 years old, broad-shouldered, with an expression of complete composure that was more unsettling than anger would have been. To his right, one step back, stood Garrett Calloway, holding nothing and looking at nothing in particular. His stillness, the stillness of a man whose judgment had been forming for 17 years and had now arrived fully at its conclusion. Beside Colt, her shoulder almost touching his arm, stood Marin Whitfield. Harrington, in her good dress with her hair pinned carefully and with the particular quality of presence that belongs to people who have stopped apologizing for existing. Harker climbed down from the wagon. He was a professional, and professionals assess situations before they commit to approaches, and what he saw in the four people on that porch required a moment of reassessment. He had been told he was coming to confront a domestic employee with a complaint from an aggrieved employer. He had not been told he was coming to confront the wife of Colt Harrington on the steps of Colt Harrington's house, with Colt Harrington standing next to her. "Mr. Harrington," he soared, "I'm here regarding a Miss Maren Whitfield, formerly employed by the Davenport household in Philadelphia." "My wife," Colt said. "Mrs. Harrington. Formerly employed by the Davenport household, yes. Married to me as of 2 days ago. What is the nature of your business?" Harker recovered well. He produced a folded document from his coat. "I carry a formal complaint from Mr. Lawrence Davenport alleging the theft of jewelry valued at considerable sum from his household by the individual in question. I'm here to formally serve notice of this complaint." Colt descended one step. "May I see it?" Harker handed it over. Colt read it with the unhurried attention of a man who reads legal documents regularly and understands what he is reading. Then he held it out to Garrett, who took it and read it as well, and folded it and held it. "This is a private complaint," Colt said. "Not a warrant, not an instrument of arrest, not a finding by any court or officer of the law. It is one man's assertion, unsupported by evidence, submitted to no authority, carrying no legal force." He looked at Harker. "Is that your understanding of the document as well?" Harker's jaw was doing something careful. "The complaint is the first step in a legal process that could result in—" "I have here," Colt said, and reached back to take the folder of documents that Garrett produced from beneath his arm, a sworn statement from a Mrs. Ruth Alcott, formerly housekeeper of the Davenport household in Philadelphia, attesting to the events of the evening on which my wife was dismissed. Mrs. Alcott left the Davenport household's employ 8 months ago and is currently residing in St. Louis. She has no interest in the outcome of this matter beyond the accuracy of the record." He held the document out. Harker took it. He read it. His two men stood behind him with the expression of people who are beginning to understand they are not on the winning side of something. "I also have," Colt continued, "documentation relating to 2 previous incidents involving Mr. Lawrence Davenport in female domestic employees of his household, both of which were resolved through private financial settlements that Mr. Davenport was evidently quite eager to reach." He allowed a moment of silence. "I have reason to believe that the judges of Philadelphia, several of whom my lawyer has occasion to correspond with professionally, would find the pattern suggested by these documents to be of considerable interest should this matter proceed to any official forum." Harker looked at the documents in his hand. He was a professional, and professionals know when a position has become untenable, and the position he had arrived in was becoming untenable with some speed. "Furthermore," Colt said, and his voice had dropped half a register, the voice of a man speaking a final thing, "my wife came to this ranch, worked honestly, and has done nothing that deserves to be followed across 4 states by a man carrying accusations that the family making them would prefer never be examined closely. I am asking you as a professional courtesy to return to Kansas City and convey to Mr. Davenport that the matter is concluded. If he chooses to pursue it, I will pursue the documentation I have described through every legal avenue available to me until the only name in Kansas and Philadelphia associated with impropriety is his own." The porch was very quiet. The October wind moved through the yard with its usual indifference to human proceedings. Harker looked at the documents. He looked at Colt. He looked at Maren, who was looking back at him with an expression that was not triumphant and not afraid and not apologetic, the expression of a woman who has simply stopped being available for certain kinds of treatment. He looked at his 2 men. They looked back at him with the expressions of men whose enthusiasm for the enterprise had departed. "I will relay your message to Mr. Davenport," Harker said. He folded the documents and returned them to Colt. He nodded the brief, formal nod of a professional, acknowledging a superior position. Then he climbed back onto the wagon. As the wagon turned and moved toward the gate, Edmund Harrington's hired buggy came through it from the other direction. Edmund had not been invited and had not needed to be. He had his own sources in Concordia, and those sources had told him enough to bring him out at speed, his face arranged in the expression of a man who is running out of options and knows it and intends to make the remaining ones count. He stepped down from the buggy and looked at Harker's departing wagon and then at the four people on the porch with the calculation of a man revising a plan in real time. "I see Harker is leaving," he said. "He is," Colt said, "without having accomplished his purpose, without having had a purpose worth accomplishing." Edmund came to the foot of the porch steps and looked up at his nephew with the expression he had been perfecting for 30 years, the expression of a man who believes the world owes him something specific and has never stopped being surprised that it disagrees. "You've married her," he said, not accusing, simply noting the board position. "I have." Quickly. "When something is right, there's no particular virtue in delay." Edmund looked at Marin. She returned the look with the same quality of attention she gave everything, which was to say completely and without performance. He had expected perhaps satisfaction or defiance or the slight uncertain quality of a woman who was aware her position was being contested. He found none of these things. He found someone who had decided that his assessment of her was not information she required. He looked back at Colt. "Your father's will required a wife," he said, "not a cook, not a mail-order arrangement made in haste under legal pressure." "My father's will required a lawful marriage," Colt said, "which is what I have. The law is not concerned with the sentiment of the arrangements." "The law is not, but the community is. The people who do business with this ranch are. A man who finds a wife through a newspaper advertisement, a woman with a questionable past and forged references." "Edmund," Fletcher spoke from Colt's left. His voice was not raised. It was the voice of a man who has been quiet for a long time and has chosen this moment to stop being quiet, and the quality of that choice was audible in every word. "The advertisement was my idea. I placed it. I reviewed the responses. I recommended Marin Whitfield to my brother because her letter talked about work and honesty and nothing else. If there is a question about the wisdom of that choice, it is mine to answer, not Colt's." Edmund looked at Fletcher with something close to surprise. In his understanding of the Harrington family, Fletcher was the younger brother, the affable one, the one who did not make strategic decisions. The man speaking to him now did not match that understanding. "Furthermore," Fletcher continued, "if you choose to spread the story you're apparently planning to spread about how this marriage was made, I will personally make it my project to ensure that every person in this county knows exactly what you have spent the past 5 years trying to do to your nephew's ranch and why." He paused. "I have been patient with you because you are family. I am done being patient." Edmund looked at Fletcher. He looked at Garrett, who had not moved and had not spoken, and whose presence throughout this confrontation had carried the weight of a man who had kept records for 17 years and was prepared to use every one of them. "I have worked for this family for 17 years, Garrett said, and his voice had the quality of a man reading a prepared statement, each word placed with care. "I will testify in any court in Kansas to the character, competence, and honest management of Colt Harrington. I will testify to the quality of work and the integrity of conduct demonstrated by Mrs. Harrington in the 3 weeks she has been at this ranch, and I will testify to the nature and consistency of the interference that has come from your direction since the week she arrived." He paused. "I kept records. I always keep records." Edmund stood at the foot of the porch steps for a long moment. He was a man who had spent 30 years understanding the world in terms of advantages and disadvantages, positions and vulnerabilities, things that could be leveraged and things that could not. He was performing the calculation now, the rapid practice calculation of a man who has done it thousands of times. The calculation was not going in his favor. He looked at Colt last. Colt was watching him with the patient, clear-eyed attention of a man who has nothing left to prove to this particular person and knows it. "You think you've won something," Edmund said. "I think," Colt said quietly, "that I'm living on my own land, in my own house, with my wife, with people I trust beside me. That's not winning something. That's just a life." He paused. "You could have had a version of that too if you had wanted it. You still could. The invitation stands, Edmund. Come to this ranch as family without the other agenda, and you will be received as family. But the other agenda ends today. One way or the other, it ends today." Edmund looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the ranch around him, the corrals, the barn, the working equipment of a serious operation, the land stretching away in every direction, land that had been in the Harrington family for 30 years and would remain in it for 30 more. He nodded once. It was not the nod of a man who has been persuaded. It was the nod of a man who has recalculated and recognized that the available paths forward do not include the one he came here for. He climbed back into his buggy. He drove out the gate without looking back. The porch was quiet. The afternoon light lay long and golden across the yard. Somewhere in the near distance, cattle moved with the unhurried purpose that cattle always have, and the sound of it was the particular sound of things continuing in their ordinary and necessary way. Marin released a breath she had been holding without knowing it. Colt turned and looked at her. She looked at him. After a moment, she said very quietly, "Thank you." "Nothing to thank me for," he said. "You didn't need rescuing. You needed someone willing to stand next to you." She looked at him a moment longer, then she turned and went back inside to the kitchen that was hers, to the work that was hers, to the life that was being built around her with the slow, solid accumulation of honest days. 3 weeks after Harker's visit, one of the ranch hands was discovered with a hand-drawn map of the eastern pasture in his coat pocket. The map was detailed and recent, and it had not been made for personal use. Garrett brought the information to Colt at the end of the workday with the flat, unornamented delivery of a man presenting evidence rather than constructing a narrative. "Rustler," to Fletcher said. "Likely," Garrett said, "or someone providing information to them. The practical result is the same." Colt looked at the map which Garrett had spread on the kitchen table. He looked at the detail in it, the care with which the water sources and the fence lines in the shelter areas had been noted. This was not a map made by someone who had glanced at the land and sketched what they remembered. This was a map made by someone who had spent time. "He's been here 3 months, Garrett said. "Good references. Plausible ones. I can't verify the source now." Colt looked at the map for another moment. Then he folded it carefully and handed it back to Garrett. "Move the herd from the eastern pasture tonight. Quietly. Don't explain the reason to anyone except the 3 of us." He paused. "I'll go into Concordia tomorrow. I need to know what's planned and when." Marin, who was at the stove with her back to the table, said, "Colt." She did not turn around. Her voice was level as it always was. "I know," he said. "Do you?" He was quiet. She set down the spoon she was holding and turned. She looked at him across the kitchen with those direct gray eyes that had seen through him on a wagon seat on the first afternoon she arrived in this part of the world. You have Garrett, she said. You have Fletcher. You have men who know this county and this community and who can find out what you need to know without any of this putting you in a position where someone with a reason to recognize you sees you in a hat that doesn't belong to you. She paused. You said it yourself. The method stops working the moment someone who knows you looks twice. And now there are people in this county with a reason to look twice. Fletcher looked at the floor. Garrett looked at the window. Colt looked at his wife. You're right, he said. I know I'm right. I've been right about it for a while. I know that too. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then Colt looked at Garrett. Take Doyle and ride into Concordia tonight. Not as ranch business, just two men having an evening. Listen for anything about the eastern pasture or movement of stock in the next week. He paused. You know what to listen for. Garrett nodded. He took his hat from the hook by the door and was outside before the door finished swinging. Fletcher looked at his brother. He looked at Marin. He looked at his brother again. He did not say anything, but the expression on his face was one that Colt had been looking at for 27 years and understood completely. He went out as well. Colt stood in the kitchen with his wife, and the evening settled around the ranch, and he said nothing for a moment. I've been hiding in that hat, he said, since before the cattle were stolen, before there was a reason. I've been hiding in it since I came back from the East and didn't know how to be who I was supposed to be here. He paused. My father wanted a certain kind of man. I wasn't it. And I thought if I could move through the world without anyone knowing who I was, then no one could tell me I was doing it wrong. Marin looked at him without hurry. You're not hiding anymore, she said. No. He looked at her. I haven't been since about the third morning in this kitchen. She turned back to the stove. Then there's nothing left to burn, she said, except the hat. He did not burn it that night. He went into Concordia the next morning alone, dressed as Cal Hayes for what he told himself was the last time, because there was one piece of information he needed, and he could not in honesty ask Garrett to gather it for him. The timing, the specific date the rustlers planned to move, the kind of precise intelligence that would give the sheriff something actionable rather than merely suggestive. He got what he came for. Sitting in the corner of the Concordia saloon with his hat pulled low and his coffee growing cold beside him, he listened to two men at the bar speak with the careless confidence of people who believe they are not being overheard, and he heard the date and the location and the number of men involved. He had what he needed. He stood up to leave. He did not make it to the door. The man who stopped him was not one of the two at the bar. He had been sitting in the shadows near the back wall, someone Colt had not registered when he came in. Someone who had been at a cattle auction in Wichita 18 months prior and had the kind of memory for faces that Colt had not anticipated and could not have planned for. There were two of them by the time they had him in the alley behind the saloon, and they worked efficiently and without particular feeling the way men work when they have been paid to send a message rather than motivated by personal grievance. The message was clear enough. They knew who he was. They knew where the ranch was. They knew what he valued. When it was finished, they left him in the January cold, and he lay there for a period of time he could not accurately estimate before the particular stubbornness that had built this ranch from the ground up reasserted itself, and he got himself upright and onto his horse and pointed the animal south. He made it to the ranch gate before he lost consciousness. Garrett found him there at dusk, slumped over the saddle, And the next 2 hours passed in the way that bad hours pass, with a speed that is a kind of mercy. The doctor came out from Concordia. 2 ribs cracked, not broken. Bruising significant. Rest required. Marin sat in the chair beside the bed through the night and into the following morning. She did not sleep. She held her book in her lap without reading it, and when Colt finally opened his eyes in the pale gray light and found her there, she said nothing for a long moment, simply looked at him with those steady gray eyes in which he had long since learned to read everything. "Tell me," she said. He told her what he had learned, what had happened, what the men in the alley had said. She listened to all of it without interruption. "The information you went for," she said when he finished. "Did you get it?" "Yes." "Then Garrett takes it to the sheriff." "Yes." She set her book on the side table. The morning light was thin and cold through the window, the kind of January light that makes no promises. She looked at him, at the bruised face and the careful way he was holding himself against the pain of the ribs, at the man who had gone into that alley one last time in a borrowed identity. Because old habits are harder to leave than we understand when we are still inside them. "Colt," she said, "no more." "No more," he agreed. "Not because of this. Not because it's dangerous." "I know. Because you have people," she said. "You have had people 4 months. You just hadn't let yourself use them fully." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the winter light moved across the floor of the bedroom in its slow and indifferent way. "After this heals," he said, "I'm going to burn the hat." She looked at him. Something in her expression settled the particular settling of a person who has heard a true thing said at exactly the right time. "I'll have Fletcher lay a fire," she said. She stood, straightened the blanket across his chest with the same efficient care she brought to everything, and went downstairs to start the morning. 2 hours later, when Garrett came to the door with his hat in his hands, she gave him the information about the eastern pasture and the date and the number of men, and he nodded once and went to find his horse. He burned it on a Tuesday evening in January, 3 weeks after the ribs had begun to knit themselves back together in a small fire at the edge of the yard in the cold, clear air of a Kansas winter night that had no weather in it, only stars and stillness and the distant sound of the herd in the southern pasture. He fed it the hat first, then the shirt, then the trousers, each piece going in deliberately, without ceremony but without haste, the way you dispose of something that has served its purpose and has now become a liability. Fletcher stood 10 feet away, his hands in his pockets, watching without comment. Garrett came out of the barn, saw what was happening, and stopped. He watched for a moment, then he went back inside. When the fire had done its work, Colt stood and looked at the coals for a moment. Then he turned and went back to the house, to the kitchen, to his wife who was making bread for the morning, and did not ask what he had been doing outside, because she already knew, and the knowing was already in her expression when he came through the door, warm and quiet and entirely without fanfare. He sat down at the table. She worked. The kitchen was warm. "Garrett's information was good," he said after a moment. "The rustlers are planning to move on the eastern pasture next week." "I know. He told me this afternoon." "He told you. He tells me most things now." She shaped the dough with her hands. "He said you should know that the connection to Edmund can't be proven, but shouldn't be assumed to be absent. Also what I thought. He also said you should let the sheriff handle the actual capture and keep the ranch hands well away from the confrontation. Also what I thought." She glanced at him over her shoulder. "Then it seems Garrett and I have been having your thoughts for you while you were burning your wardrobe." He looked at her for a moment. Then he laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes without preparation and is therefore the most honest kind. And it was the first time she had heard him laugh like that since the ribs, and it filled the kitchen for a moment and faded and left the room lighter than it had been before. "I'll speak to the sheriff in the morning," he said. She put the dough to rise and came and sat across from him at the table, and they drank the last of the evening's coffee together in the kitchen that had been the center of the best and most honest part of the past 3 months. The rustlers came on a Thursday night in February. They came to the eastern pasture and found it empty. The cattle moved 3 days earlier under cover of an ordinary-looking herd rotation that no one had questioned. They found instead Sheriff Aldous Crane and 4 of his deputies and Garrett Calloway, who had stationed himself at the fence line with the patience of a man entirely comfortable waiting in the cold for something he knows is coming. It was over within the hour. No shots were fired. No one was injured. The men were taken to Concordia, and the matter was placed in the hands of the law where it belonged. And Colt Harrington was not present for any of it because he was at the ranch with his wife where he belonged. The hand who had drawn the map was among those taken. The connection to Edmund Harrington was, as Garrett had predicted, unprovable and therefore not pursued. Colt did not pursue it. He had said what he intended to say to Edmund on the front porch, and he had meant it, and there was nothing to be gained from reopening a war that had already been ended on his own terms. He wrote a short letter to Edmund the following week. It said that the matter with the rustlers had been resolved, that the ranch was secure, and that the invitation he had extended on the porch remained open if Edmund chose to accept it. He did not wait for a reply because whether the reply came or not was Edmund's business, and Edmund's business was no longer his to carry. In September of 1879, on the morning of Colt's 33rd birthday, his lawyer in Kansas City confirmed in writing that the terms of William Harrington's will had been satisfied. Colt Harrington was lawfully married to Marin Whitfield Harrington. The 50% contingency would not be transferred. Harrington Ranch remained wholly his. He read the letter at his desk. He folded it and put it in the bottom drawer. Then he went to the kitchen where Marin was making breakfast for the ranch hands, and he poured 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her and said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying. She looked at the cup. She looked at him. She knew what it meant without being told. "Happy birthday," she said. "It is," he agreed. Edmund Harrington sent a brief letter of acknowledgement 3 weeks later. It was formal and contained nothing personal and closed with a single line that neither of them commented on, but that Marin kept pressed between the pages of the household accounts book for the rest of her life. It said only, "Your father would not have chosen this. I think that may be why it will work. It will." On a warm July evening that same year, Garrett Calloway came to the kitchen door with his hat in his hands, which was something he had never done before, and told Marin that if she was feeling unwell in the mornings and finding the smell of coffee, which had always been her particular pleasure, suddenly objectionable, he thought she might want to send for the doctor. She looked at him. "How did you know before I did?" she asked. "I've been watching this family for 17 years, he said. "I noticed things." He put his hat back on and went back to his work. She sent for the doctor. The doctor confirmed what Garrett had already understood. The baby would come in late winter February, most likely perhaps early March. She told Colt that evening in the kitchen because the kitchen was where they told each other things. He was sitting at the table with his coffee and the day's mail, and he looked up when she sat down across from him, and whatever he saw in her expression told him before she said a word, because he had been watching her for 9 months with the same quality of attention he gave to the land he loved. He set down his coffee cup, she told him. He was quiet for a long moment. The particular quiet of a man receiving something he had not entirely believed he would receive, something he had perhaps stopped expecting. not from pessimism, but from the long habit of wanting things carefully, so that wanting them too openly would not make the absence worse. "Are you well?" he asked. His voice was careful in the way that voices are careful when the feeling behind them is very large. "Yes," she said. "The doctor says everything is as it should be." He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his. He looked at her hand and then at her face and then at some middle point that was not the table and not the window, the point people look at when they are comprehending something that has just changed the shape of the future. "A child," he said, as if testing the word's weight. "In February," she said. He brought her hand to his mouth and held it there for a moment. Not a kiss exactly, just a holding. And then he set it carefully back on the table and looked at her with the green eyes that had watched his own land from a wagon seat on the day they met. "I'll build a cradle," he said. "I know you will." Fletcher, when he heard, drove out from his own ranch 30 miles north and arrived unannounced 2 days later with a look on his face that he clearly had no intention of moderating and had no ability to. "You're going to be an uncle," Marin told him, and he sat down at the kitchen table and put his face in his hands for a moment and then straightened up and asked for coffee with the businesslike tone of a man reasserting his composure. And Harriet Holt, who had been waiting nearby for this exact development, set a cup in front of him and patted his shoulder once and went back to her work. Samuel William Harrington was born on a cold morning in February 1880, and he arrived with the announcement of a person who had opinions about his arrival and intended to share them immediately. Colt was not in the room. Harriet had made her position on this matter clear in terms that left no room for discussion. He sat in the hallway outside the bedroom door with his back against the wall and his elbows on his knees and his hands folded in front of him, and he did not move for 4 hours. Fletcher arrived at some point in the second hour and sat down beside him without being invited, and they sat together in the hallway, the way they had sat in the barn on the first night, in the particular quiet of men who have nothing useful to say and have decided that presence is the more honest offering. Garrett waited downstairs. He did not pace. He stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the February morning in the bare fields and the sky, and he held his hat in his hands and turned it once, twice with the steady rhythm of a man keeping time against something he cannot control. When Harriet opened the bedroom door, her expression told them everything before she spoke. "A boy," she said, "healthy, loud, looks like his father." Colt stood up. He went into the room. He came back out 20 minutes later, and he stood in the doorway and looked at his brother, and his face had the expression of a man who has encountered something that exceeds the available vocabulary, something for which the ordinary instruments of description are simply insufficient. And so he stood in the doorway and said nothing at all. Fletcher stood up and crossed the hallway and put his hand on his brother's shoulder and held it there. And that was enough. They named the boy Samuel after Colt's grandfather, who had been the one member of the previous generation of Harrington men who had understood that land was a stewardship rather than a possession, and who had taught a small boy to watch the grass move before he taught him anything else. 10 years passed in the way that good years pass, with enough difficulty to give the good things their proper weight, and enough of the good things to make the difficulty worth carrying. There were hard winters that took cattle and worried everyone. There were dry summers that turned the grass pale and made every water source a matter of calculation. There was a season of low prices that required the kind of careful management that kept Colt and Garrett up late over ledger books for 3 months straight. Fletcher's ranch 30 miles north grew and occasionally struggled and grew again, and he came to Harrington Ranch once a month and sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked with his brother and his sister-in-law with the particular ease of people who have chosen each other's company rather than simply inherited it. Garrett Calloway remained. He would remain for many years more. In the second year after Samuel's birth, he was ill for 2 weeks with a fever that worried everyone on the ranch, and Marin nursed him through it with the same efficient, undemonstrative competence she brought to everything. And when he recovered and came to the kitchen to tell her he was back on his feet, he stood in the doorway for a long moment before he came in, and he said, "You didn't have to do that." And she said, "You are part of this family." "Of course I did." And he nodded once and went back to his work, and something in the architecture of the ranch changed slightly from that day, the way a building settles when the last necessary stone is placed. Marin taught reading to the children of the ranch hands in the mornings after breakfast at the kitchen table, and later in the small room that Colt built onto the side of the house for the purpose, the room she had asked for without apology, and he had built without being asked twice. 3 children in the first year, 7 in the second. Well, by the time Samuel was old enough to be among them, sitting at his mother's table, learning the letters that his grandfather, William Harrington, had never thought necessary for the children of working men. She wrote to Agnes in Philadelphia every month without fail. Agnes eventually came west on a train with 2 large bags in a practical expression and spent 3 weeks at the ranch, and said at the end of her visit that she understood now why Marin had not come back, and that understanding it did not make her less glad that Marin had not come back. Victoria Ashmore married a lawyer from Lawrence the following spring after Edmund's final visit. Marin heard about it from Harriet, who heard it from the feed merchant's wife who had been at the wedding. She thought of the young woman who had sat at her kitchen table and said she was still learning to say no to her father, and she hoped the lawyer from Lawrence was a man worth saying yes to. On an evening in October of 1888, 10 years from the month that a wagon had rolled along the road from Concordia, with 2 people on its seat who were in the process of deciding whether to trust each other, Colt and Marin sat together on the front porch of the main house on the bench he had built the previous spring. Samuel, 9 years old, was on the porch steps reading a book in the last of the evening light with the focused intensity of a boy who has inherited his mother's ability to be entirely present in a thing. The horses moved in the near corral. The cattle were settled and far away, and audible only as a faint presence at the edges of the evening. "Do you know what I think about," Marin said, "when I think about the first day?" He was quiet, waiting. "The way you watched the grass," she said, "from the wagon. You were supposed to be someone who worked other people's land, and you kept looking at the grass along the road, the way a man looks at something that belongs to him, something he loves." She paused. "That was when I knew. Not the hands. The hands confirmed it, but I knew before the hands." She looked at the evening sky, which was the particular color of October at that hour, a deep, clear blue going slowly to indigo at its upper edges. "You were watching the land the way I watch bread rising, like it matters, like you're responsible for it." He looked at her, and I had spent 8 months hiding behind a hat. "You had spent 8 months trying to find a way to be seen without being known," she said. "That's different from hiding. That's a person who wants to be understood and doesn't know how to ask for it." She paused. "Most people don't know how to ask for it." The evening went on around them. Samuel turned a page. The first stars appeared in the pale upper sky. "I was right to burn it," he said. "Yes, I should have done it sooner. You did it when you were ready. People do things when they're ready and not before, and that's not a fault. It's just the truth of how things work." She looked at him with the great eyes that had not changed in 10 years, the eyes that still considered everything they looked at with the same complete and unhurried attention. "You were ready when you had something to be ready for." He took her hand. The hand with his mother's ring on it, worn smooth now by 10 years of kitchen work and ranch work and the ordinary daily friction of a life fully lived. I would have asked you on the second morning, he said. I told you that on the first night. You did. I meant it then, and I mean it now. I know you do. Samuel looked up from his book. Mama, he said with the matter-of-fact tone of a 9-year-old who has observed his parents being sentimental and decided to document it. Are you and Papa going to sit out here until it gets dark again? Probably, Marin said. Samuel considered this. He looked at the page. He looked back at them. All right, he said, with the equanimity of a boy who has grown up understanding that his parents consider the front porch a serious place, and went back to his reading. Colt looked at his son. He looked at the land. He looked at his wife, who was watching the sky with the composed attention she gave to everything worth attending, which was in her understanding of the world most things. Marin, he said. Yes. Thank you for asking me on the wagon. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, thank you for not denying it. The stars came out one by one over the Kansas prairie, and the bench held them both, and the boy on the steps read his page, and somewhere in the evening, dark the land went on in his vast and patient way, and the house behind them was lit and warm, and the kitchen smelled of the bread that had been made that morning and would be made again tomorrow, and everything that mattered was exactly where it belonged.